We'll stay on screen here. I'll play the clip, and then we'll kind of discuss it and what Pat's been talking about. Because despite him, flipping a little bit on Detroit and being shown more love as of late, he wasn't wrong in this clip. So let's hear from Pat McAfee what he said today about Motor City Dan Campbell. Let's check it out.
So I think a lot of people think he's big dumb dipshit. That is not the case at all.
Nope.
If you look at what he's been able to do to the Detroit Lions, and obviously it's alongside Brad, and it's alongside a lot of great coordinators and great players, but there's one man that is setting the tone for the Detroit Lions since he got the job. It was a man who said, hey, we're going to embrace Detroit. We're going to be about Detroit. We're going to be tough. We're going to be gritty, and we're going to draft the right guys. Now, all these draft picks come after the season that took place, before the first season happened. Remember, his pillar player, Penei Sewell and St. Brown. Both of them brand new deals, still on the squad. They were the people they wanted to build and set the team's culture around, and they certainly did that. In a matter of 3 years, they're now the favorites of the NFC North. They're now one of the favorites to be in the Super Bowl, where for 150 years the Detroit Lions were laughed at pretty much? Yep. This dude needs to get a little bit more credit for how he is as a coach, for how he's been able to turn around a program, turn around a building, and how he's been able to remain himself whenever he's doing these press conferences. Now, obviously, Detroit's not a big market, and they are the Detroit Lions. Of course. And the way he delivers his messaging publicly is one that a lot of people cannot take serious, potentially, if he didn't want to. But he's a great coach. Yeah. And he's built his team on everything that you need to win. They're fully bought in. They're fully committed. That's why whenever you hear the Lions are going to be in joint practices, 10,000% that there's going to be an us versus them bunker mentality, because that's what MCDC has literally built his entire team on. So there's going to be brawls. Some of these fights this morning coming out of practice.
Hey, well, I mean,
gets me fired up. I'm not going to lie.
He's not wrong. I will correct him, though. Detroit is a pretty big market. I think they're like a top 5 market in the United States. So, but hey, I do.
Is Detroit actually a top 5 market?
Top 10. They're a top 10 market. So they're a pretty good sized market. But basically, what he's saying though, the rebuild boys from where he was with what he was given till now, he's not wrong. Everything he said is true.
Yeah, that's why I had Dan Campbell as my top 5 NFL coach at 5. It was like you could people think he's a meathead. People think that he just is like, I just like bite kneecaps, have some chaw in my mouth, and no, Dan Campbell's like an elite head coach. He's built this organization up. I don't think he gets enough credit. Like, let's be honest here. How many coaches have tried to come into Detroit since the 90s and do what Dan Campbell has done? A lot. Like, we've gone through so many different regimes, and Dan Campbell's been able to do it. And yeah, you could say Sheila or Brad Holmes, but Dan's the one that has came in. I say this all the time. This man came in and set the tone instantly in the culture and said, we're biting kneecaps. And when you fall or when every time you hit us, we're going to bite another part of your kneecap and another one. And we're going to keep getting up. Like, that's a tone he set. And people laughed at him, but the players in the building probably were like, no, I like this. Like, this is a football guy. And he has built, like, think about how fast it has taken him to build this program. Like, do you guys remember when we did sports talk 2 years ago when Dan was, and Jeff, I know you remember this being on the morning show, that like the timeline that you and Adam would lay out was like, hey, year 3 is this. Year 4, you can start competing for an NFC North. Year 5, and maybe make a playoff. Year 5, you're competing for, the NFC Championship game in the Super. This dude did it in 3 years. Like, he expedited this thing and got this thing done within 3 years. Like, he almost went to the playoffs year 2. Like, put that in perspective with the roster that he had and the young guys he had. Like, that is unbelievable. Shout out to Pat too I know a lot of people say Pat doesn't give that much. Like, he was going at Dan for a while in the Lions. Finally giving him some credit too.
Yeah, and just how he's won and also just how he's developed players. I know Ben Johnson gets a lot of credit for being able to put these players in situations, but seeing how Jahmyr Gibbs, Sam Laporta, all the rookies that we talk about offensively and defensively, how they can just step in and play, that shows a lot about what Dan Campbell is teaching these players in the offseason, also between the weeks. So Dan Campbell, as far as a developer too, like, he deserves a lot more credit for the talent that he's developed.
Yeah, I give Dan a ton of credit. His leadership, the changing a culture, it's like, college coaches are, especially great college coaches, there's that, culture setter, and you're recruiting and all this stuff. But you see in the NFL, like, culture just, it works, but you have to show results, and you have to get guys to buy in. And Dan is very good at that, even when they're losing, which it's very easy to lose a locker room. I mean, these are grown men making millions of dollars. And if you're not winning games, guys are clocking out mentally. It's easy to lose a locker room. it's tough what Dan's doing, like no matter what. And then now they're finally having success, and the guys are like, oh, so this is why. That's why any adversity they face, like that's why Dan is pretty much widely regarded as a top 5, top 10 NFL coach right now. After one season of true success, one season of making the playoffs, because you saw what this team looked like. I mean, Corey brought it up. The secondary was not great. I mean, it was bad, and they were winning games by simply just bending, not breaking. But the offense, and you, of course, he would even give credit to his assistant coaches. But Dan Campbell, he doesn't want the credit. He's the same. He's consistent, and that's what you want in a head coach: consistency. Someone that's going to be the same every day, no matter what the situation is. That's what you want in any type of leader. You know, you don't want the leader to hit the panic button, then everyone else hits the panic button. Like Dan does not get phased, and that's one of his stronger qualities. I mean, he is one of the best leaders in the NFL. And I'm not just saying that because we cover the Lions. I mean, we know a lot about the NFL. We talk a lot of NFL, even though we focus more Lions, but even outside the show, we're always talking. And Dan Campbell is just, to simply put, just different. I mean, there's a handful of coaches that, you know, there's different molds of coaches. There's the offensive minded coaches. There's the defensive minded coaches. And then there's kind of that Dan Campbell, leadership quality coach, or someone that you bring in to kind of be the leader of your football team. And some guys maybe have both, where they're defensive minded, like a D'Amico Ryans. He's a very good leader. Dan's more offensive. But you see now, NFL is a copycat league. More teams are trying to find the next Dan Campbell. Like, who's a guy that we could bring in that'll just be an absolute leader and guys will follow? I mean, it's the reason I would argue that Matt Eberflus even has a job, because we had a beat writer on from Chicago, and his biggest point was, he hasn't lost the locker room yet. Like, you see how important that is, and especially when you're winning, and even when you do have tough times, like the Lions had, where they were 0-10 or whatever it was, and he still didn't lose the locker room. Like, Dan Campbell has still a lot to prove, but man, like he's a guy, and I haven't not said this once, being a Lions fan. I haven't, because I'm always skeptical about head coaches. But Dan Campbell is someone that I could see being here for a long time, very, very long time. And they gave him an extension, and he still had years left on his contract. So kudos to him, and Brad Holmes, of course.
He too, a big thing with that too, and I think a lot of people are going to come around. Like, the biggest question when it comes to like NFL teams, this was the conversation we had after the Lions lost in the NFC Championship game, was, can teams, like, is it a one-time thing, or can teams kind of continue to be in there? Like how Kyle Shanahan has done with the 49ers, is continuously have them in the NFC Championship game and Super Bowls, and kind of going for that. I think after this year, if Dan Campbell's able to take this team back to an NFC Championship game at the minimum and win another NFC North, I think that's where he starts to get a lot more credit around the NFL and around the league, to where people start putting them top 5 ahead of coach, because you're able to put it back to back. And that's like the biggest question is, hey, can a coach stay consistent? Vincent E right there, consistency. And if he does that back to back years, like you saw them finish the season 9-3 and knock the Packers and Aaron Rodgers out of the playoffs. Now you see them go 12-4 and now and go to the NFC Championship game. Now, if he puts another year together, there is no doubt in anyone's mind in the NFL that this is one of the best coaches in the NFL. And he's with the Detroit Lions. Like, there's zero doubt in my mind that he is one of the best if he's able to take this team to a Super Bowl or even another NFC Championship game.
I'm not gonna lie to you guys either. When he had his first speech and he did the kneecaps thing, like I was like, oh geez, like I don't know about that. Like I got it partially. Like I'm like, okay, because his players are gonna love that. Like I think the players laugh, but they're also like, I like this. You know, he's like he's a former player. He's speaking from a player's perspective. There was some skeptic. Like I think his personality, how he's just, it looks like when it's game time, it's game time. But outside of it, Dan likes to just have fun, and he's himself, and he's comfortable within his own skin. That like people, it's hard to like understand that, because you see like Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan, these gurus, and then you have Dan Campbell, and he's like the most, like he makes fun of himself sometimes, and you have Pat McAfee making fun of him. Like he's easy to like not take serious. But I think he likes that. Like, I think he likes being the guy that people look at and they're like, this guy's just all muscle. Like, he doesn't know. He likes being that, the underdog, I guess, in a way, because the team kind of replicates that when they play football. So he continues to surprise me, man. Even the 4th down stuff. Like, I got to a point where I'm like, fuck it. Dan Campbell's going for it. We're going for it.
Yeah, Crazy Clown said it best. I honestly didn't mind it because it was the complete opposite of Patricia. Like Patricia made my blood boil just watching him on the sideline. When he would roll around on that fucking go-kart around the practice field, like, dude, like to your point, like you're losing games. You're 3-13. You're what they were 4-12, like whatever they were. And you're riding around at practice in a fucking golf cart like that, you lose the locker room just like that. And that's why they'll even send Bob Quinn out there with them too, because they're like, well, you're the one that hired this guy and he was a complete laughing stock and no one believes in him, not even you. So I didn't even mind the Dan Campbell stuff.
Yeah, and I agree with this, Vincent, too. Coaching tree, I'm telling you, Campbell's going to have a coaching tree. He's very good, which is an underrated part of being a head coach, is finding good assistants. And actually, there's been coaches that have not figured that out and gotten fired. So it's an undervalued trait of any head coach. If you can hire the right assistants and consistently hit on getting the right coaches, it's super important. Now, ideally, if you have a guy like Sean McVay or Kyle Shanahan, you don't have to worry about assistants. But Dan, even though he's not those guys, in terms of how he's portrayed. I'm not saying he doesn't know as much football as those guys. I think he does. But those guys come off as these absolute gurus. But Dan knows ball, but he also knows humans. And he knows how to read, like, okay, this guy, like Ben Johnson or grooming Tanner Engstrand to be the next coordinator. Like, I think they like Tanner and he's comfortable with him. And same with all the assistants he has around him. Like the dude knows how to find good coaches. So I don't worry about that at all.
He almost had 2 head coaches come out this year. Like Aaron Glenn interviewed for multiple jobs. Ben Johnson.
Yeah.